Hey guys, do you like gaming? Do I look like I do? I don't know what would give it away, to be honest. It's not like there's anything that would give that away or anything. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about, I guess it's not really a doujin event, although it does feel like the word doujin in and of itself does kind of apply to what we're going to be talking about to some extent today. Because yes, we're going to be talking about a indie game event instead. This has been one that has been on my radar for a little while, since this event only started fairly recently as well. In fact, this event, it only really first began in 2023, and it's been going every year since then, which we're only in 2025, so only 3 years in. And most of the other indie game focused events within Japan all tend to be fairly fresh and new as well, most of them having started after 2020 if anything, which kind of leads into what I was talking about quite a while back of Japan not really having much of an indie scene, but it's nice to see it coming up more and more. And so we're going to be talking about one of those events today, because the one we're going to be talking about is the Tokyo Indie Game Summit. Started in 2023, as I mentioned before. It has been held in Kichijoji in Tokyo every single year since then. And I do find it to be one of those events where it's kind of interesting in its own strange way because of the way that the event is being held, if that makes any sense at all. While most doujin events, or like even like indie or creator focused events that may not even have anything to do with games or anime, most of them tend to focus on using very specific locations, which allows you to center a lot of people into a hall, and then all of the booths can be within the same hall and you can just walk around and browse everything. But for some reason for this event, maybe it has something to do with a tie-in with the neighborhood itself as well in Kichijoji. The event actually takes place across a decent part of multiple buildings within the vicinity of the train station itself. Personally, as someone who's been working in the industry for quite a while, I do find it quite interesting to see more and more of these events coming out, and I do find it to be something that I'm kind of glad to see actually happening more and more as well. Because while some people might think that, oh yeah, but there are plenty of like great doujin games that come out of Japan, and so like there is an indie scene, right, that is like fairly popular with games like Toho. Some of you might remember games like Versatia as well. Depending on how you look at it, many of the visual novel companies could also be considered indie because of the fact that they pretty much operate in very small scales, almost like an indie or doujin group as well. Well, some of them actually are doujin groups if anything. The idea of a thriving indie scene or a big one has never really been as much of a thing in Japan. Like there are some small examples like this, but for the most part, a lot of their content has always been something that would only be sold at events or at very specific doujin shops. So the amount of traction that they could get is a lot less, and it's a lot harder for them to market themselves as well, because of the fact that it's a lot harder for them to therefore prep marketing materials to market their games on a global scale because of things like the language barrier as well. And on top of that, that's something that isn't just as focused societally within Japan as well. While game design universities outside of Japan, from the ones I've seen at least, they do tend to focus on a balance of helping you to either prep to go into a specialized role in a big company if you want to do that, or giving you the more versatile skills required to actually go indie instead. With Japan, the large part of the focus for many of the big game design universities is precisely to only get people to work for the big companies instead. And while there have been successes coming out of the scene within Japan, typically these tend to be more incidental in the sense that it just so happens that these people, in spite of the fact that they sold games that were only initially available in specific events, right? Like even with Toho, it was something that was initially just sold physically at Comic-Con. People outside of Japan, either through the good fortune of some of the publishing companies that like try to focus on doujin games, bringing the games out, or people just bringing the games out and sharing it across the internet. Thanks to that, it coincidentally got big. But aside from those small titles that happen to have the good fortune to have that happen, most titles, they typically just end up being fairly small scale, and they're typically made by people who don't expect huge profits from it, with many of them not really having the expertise nor the funds to push it out to a global audience as a result. However, with this event, thanks to the sponsors that are actually there helping to fund the event itself and its organization, as well as the bigger platform that it provides for some of these indie games to reach out to people who might be interested in seeing what's coming out of Japan, it also does help make it a little easier for some of these doujin or indie groups to actually get out to a bigger audience. But yeah, as you can see from this page, there are actually quite a few different locations that are involved with the event itself, but the two that we'll actually be focusing on are the two that are over here in yellow instead of orange, as this is where most of the stage events as well as where most of the indie groups games are actually centered around. So they had stage events, which were pretty interesting as well. To be honest, unfortunately, I couldn't film in those because they did mention that they didn't want people filming specifically for those. When they have some people in the industry talking and giving advice, as well as some people talking about their experiences working on indie titles, and it does have some pretty interesting MCs for the years as well. With last year in 2024, they actually had Zen, and this year they had a VTuber there, which is the first time I think they actually had a virtual MC as well. So conceptually more interesting, although it wasn't like a super famous VTuber, so it wasn't like something that instantly caught my eye. But to be honest, I was a little surprised considering the fact that they did have a Nijisanji stage event separately, where they were like playing games and competing against each other to become the king of games. And you also had a HoloLive thing going on there, but none of the VTubers from either or were actually involved as the MC itself. But hey, in a way, it's a good way for them to get some of the more indie VTubers up and to the front as well. So I guess it kind of fits with the theme of the event as well. But anyway, for the first of the two major locations with the REI Hotel, it had multiple rooms on I think the third or fourth floor of the hotel, where all of the groups were basically centered around. Truth be told, it felt extremely packed. Like it almost felt like I was in like a Comic Cat hall or something, due to the fact that there are just so many people squeezing trying to get through. I think in total for the entirety of the event across both the hotel as well as the public hall, there were maybe 207 booths on display. And with the hotel, it really did show, since the hall itself wasn't really that massive. But as a result of that and the number of circles that they were trying to squeeze into it, you really didn't really have much space to walk around or even observe some of the games, let alone, which, you know, is kind of a problem since people are typically there to show off their games. But, you know, with the amount of people that turn up for the event, I really can't tell if it's because of the fact that the event is still really fresh. So the number of people coming each year is increasing massively, and it's making it a lot harder for them to keep up with it. Although it does feel like, considering the fact that they've been using the same venue for 3 years, it could just be also the fact that the venues themselves are just getting too cramped over the years to fit all of the foot traffic as well as the number of people that want to participate. Like, it really did feel a little rough that at times when I was going through the rows of the booths within the hotel itself, it felt like I was just going through Comic Cat all over again. Like I was getting those flashbacks, and the trauma was just like reviving my brain, minus the stink, which is already a lot of a blessing, to be honest. Surprisingly enough though, if you're lucky, there are still some booths that you can actually drop by, talk to the creators, and slowly like try the game that they have made and talk to them and discuss about it. And I found that to be quite interesting to be able to do whenever the opportunity arises. The real issue really is just, once again, due to how cramped the spaces were. Typically, while you could squeeze in, since most of them have like a single chair or two for you to sit in front of the booth to try out the games, if there are already people there, it might be a little difficult for you to figure out when they're gonna leave. And some people might stay for a while because they want to test out the game, because, you know, you can't really get as much of a feel of the game for maybe just 3 or 4 minutes. So people do tend to hang around the individual booths longer, and if they want to chat with the creators, all the more so. And I feel like that potentially was what caused some of the gems in between as well, especially with some of the game titles there which were a little more popular. There was also a voting board within the main hall of the hotel itself, not just for the hotel's games, but for all of the games that were showcased across all of the venues as well. And you could basically use a little like sticker thing to like vote on which game you thought was the best. And, you know, it felt like a pretty cool way to try and see and figure out what people thought were really interesting, so that you yourself can go and look and see what all the hype is about. But I do feel like, well, it's really good for the circles who are actually doing well to get some validation as a result. For the groups that don't, it can, as I would imagine, feel a little demoralizing for some of them as well. Really cool concept, to be honest, especially since I think they did have a ranking for the most popular games or most anticipated games of the event, but it did feel a little cutthroat, which for an event meant to celebrate individual creators and their creativity, I felt like it may have been a little out of place perhaps. That said, the venue itself for the hotel was really pretty fancy. Some of the games on display were quite interesting as well, and there was a good mix of games from PCs and consoles as well. Some gimmicky ones that had you playing with some weird custom controllers or control mechanisms that they had set up, and those, while they look interesting, I don't know for the latter if those are games that I really want to play for long at home on my own, to be honest. Meanwhile, for the Musashino public hall, which is where the rest of the booths for the other indie groups were located, it felt a lot more like a Japanese school architecturally, because of the fact that like Like, you had all the narrow corridors. You went into the buildings and it just had the wooden lacquered floors and the walls, and it all felt like a place where you would expect to be having classes maybe like 10, 15 years ago, maybe. Am I making any sense? I haven't been to a school, as you can imagine, in a very long time there, so I don't know how the modern ones are like, but it suddenly feels very reminiscent of those. For the public hall, however, instead of the fact that the building itself looked a little older and a little more rundown than a hotel, this was actually where most of the sponsors of the event were, because there were quite a lot of sponsors, both publishers who were there publishing the games that indie groups had brought to them to basically try and get out to a bigger audience, as well as some of those that were actually fairly big but not even Japanese, which was kind of interesting to see. Like, one thing I thought was kind of interesting was the fact that Ponkel, the creators of Vampire Survivor, were also a sponsor of the event, and they actually had a booth within that public hall as well. It was kind of cool. I went there and managed to get a picture of an old man. It was a good opportunity to actually interact with someone who was basically looking like what I probably would look like in the next 30 years, so best to prepare in advance. That, and you also had Nippon Ichi there, who were also showcasing one of their own titles. Like, not a title that they were publishing, like a certain game that we were talking about recently, but a title that they were developing themselves with the assistance of some other companies. Which, for those who are wondering, for smaller companies, at least within Japan, we're not talking about like indie groups, but just small companies in general, it is kind of fairly common for some of them to outsource parts of the game's development, or like art, for example, to another company to prepare, while they deal with the rest of the game themselves, simply because of the fact that they may not possess all of the talent in-house immediately on their own. With Nippon Ichi, I feel like for a long while now, they seem to be trying to toe that line of releasing titles that really do feel like more experimental and something that you would expect an indie group to release instead, which I've always thought is interesting. It just felt a little strange or bizarre to see them at an event like this, showcasing their game like an indie group themselves or something. Though, I don't know if this is something that they did intentionally, but one thing that I found to be a little weird with the logistics of the event is that it seemed like they really tried to put a lot of the groups that were a little more popular on the insides of the hall, for the Musashino public hall at least. So the rooms themselves already aren't very big to begin with. They all feel like maybe a classroom or two in size, so not massive, but at the same time, they kept trying to put all of the popular groups further into the hall, and it felt like those were the ones that constantly got flooded with people, which as a result, as you can imagine, it made it really hard to walk around the inside of the room and browse, since they basically had the tables in a circle, but you couldn't walk a circle around all of the different booths simply because like parts of it would jam up because people are trying to get all the way inside to look at specific groups as well. Like, it could just be, once again, that they just misjudged the number of people that would turn up for the event, or maybe those groups just ended up being dark horses and they really didn't know that they were going to be that popular until the day of the event itself. But I feel like when it comes to other events that I've been to, especially for doujin events, they tend to put a lot more focus on the logistics of things like this, so as to try to prevent like choke points from occurring within the middle of the hall. Needless to say, it doesn't always work out, but even when it doesn't, they tend to have like the people on the ground who are ready to try and crowd control. If there's a circle in the middle that's really causing a flood to happen, they will try to actually control the line so that people would actually line up somewhere that wouldn't be as obstructive, maybe putting parts of the line outside the hall instead. Or if the person, like with Bocchi the Rock's artist, when the series blew up at Comic Cat after that, they just like shifted her completely outside of the hall instead, because of the fact that they knew that the flood of people that would want to go to her booth would be too immense to try to keep her in her original spot prior to Bocchi the Rock's blowing up. Like, I feel like most other events tend to deal with crowd control a lot better, and so this feel like it could have been better handled, although once again, I don't know how much of it was caused by just poor planning and how much of it was just they just simply did not expect the level of traffic that they were getting this year, and therefore ended up the way it was. Either way, it was pretty cool to see that the event overall was just so lively, with so many people walking around trying to browse through all of the games as well. Like, it is interesting to see that even for the Japanese audience as well, there are actually a lot of people who are interested in and trying to get to know more about the indie development scene as well. Also, aside from this, within Public Hall, there was actually an entire room dedicated to Hololive's indie production, publication project, which basically aims to help people who want to make Hololive games to be able to push it to market, and to also help, for Hololive themselves to be able to control what is being done with their IP, so you can ensure that the games that are being produced and that you are able to to endorse, you can try to help to endorse to help it reach an even bigger audience, and it can also help you to therefore encourage more people to make games of a certain type or style that end up making it such that your IP, I guess, or the brand name of Hololive would actually blow up even more, which was pretty interesting to see. But yeah, truth be told, I didn't even know that this entire like publication arm of theirs was even a thing until I actually went to the event and I just saw like them getting an entire room dedicated for them to run all of this, to be honest. It's interesting to see, more so just for the idea, I guess, for the concept of them trying to push for people to make more fan games. Since usually when it comes to a lot of like this kind of fan-made content, which I guess would fall more under what people typically think of as doujin content, a lot of it tends to be more of people working within the limitations that companies are setting for them. And in this case, while it is true that by deciding what they will and will not publish, Hololive is still, or I guess Cover Corp is still trying to put restrictions on what people can make. They are doing it more so in the, I guess when you talk about like the carrot and stick, this is more like the carrot, where you're basically providing more benefits and support to people who make certain types of games, and so you can try to help to encourage more people to make that content, which I feel is something that is quite lacking with many of the bigger companies in general. So to see them actually actively trying to encourage the content production instead of just restricting it was something that was very experimental feeling. But hey, if it works and more companies do that in the future, I feel like it's a big plus for people who want to make fan games for whatever IPs out there as well. Then aside from the two main locations, there were also a bunch of the smaller locations that I mentioned before within the pamphlet itself. There was a event area under the train station itself where they were basically holding what felt like a festival games. I don't know if that's the right word. I guess more like carnival games overseas, but this games felt more interactive in the sense that it's a little more physical, and it reminds me a lot more of like the festival games that you would see at like Japanese festivals instead, or I guess like in carnivals in like America or something. I don't know, I've never been to America, to be honest, where the focus is more on physical interactivity, you know, like shooting a dart gun or something at a target or something, rather than it being just a PC or console experience where you're sitting in front of a screen and just playing a blockbuster game or something. They didn't really manage to try out those as much since the station was already really packed and most people were there with their kids, and it felt a little awkward to squeeze in and being like, yeah, I want to try it too! You know, and I feel like I've gotten like some weird looks for even trying to do that, so I just looked at the games a lot from afar and like how strange or bizarre, I guess in a way they're very experimental with the ways or like the gimmicks that they try to use to get you to play with something that isn't a standard controller like a keyboard or a console controller either. To be honest, they don't feel like the kind of games that you would expect, like, you know, people who really are into games to be actively playing their homes. I don't think anybody's gonna want to play Credit Card Swiper the game as a professional speedrunner. But I do think that selecting those type of games for the train station itself was a pretty good like marketing decision, to be honest, since if you want to show people what like small time creators can do, and especially if you want to show it to people who aren't already into games, because you know it's a train station in general in a fairly populated neighborhood, so people who go through there don't necessarily have to be people who are already into the scene, and especially for families who are going through since it's a weekend, it's a very good way to actually get them to basically be able to play something together, since these are things that you as a parent can go with your kid and just like fool around and play with them. It's a good way to show the general audience that there's a lot more variety, as well as the scale at which people can produce games has improved a lot, especially for parents from back in their day where most of this would probably have required a giant like arcade board or something, which would have been produced by a big company like Sega, for example, and to show them something that could potentially come, well, if not close, at least reminiscent to what they played back in the day, and showing them that it now can be created by a group of like 4 or 5 people as well. They also had a booth outside of a mall where they were selling event goods like memorabilia, like clothes and tote bags and the like. It felt really weird though, this one, because of the fact that it was just outside of the mall instead, like in the open. It felt like if there was just a freak rainstorm or something, it would have been really awkward, especially for the people who were working the booth, since there wasn't really any sign of any way for them to keep everything covered. And the thing is that if they only were able to get that space, then I guess it would have been something that just couldn't be helped. But the thing is that they did actually have in that same mall building on the 5th floor a programming like workshop that was going on as well. So I don't see why they couldn't have just put all of this on the 5th floor as well. I guess in a way, if they did, there would have been less traffic towards it. But it did feel a little weird just seeing all of it like sprawled outside instead, although it did look really cool as a result, I guess. That's it. Overall, I did find the games at the event to be fairly interesting, and there were a few that were introduced there that I did end up playing a little bit, even on stream here and there, because they just felt interesting enough for me to want to just try out in general. Like there was a game called Tonaeru, which was a very short game that I remember playing on stream a lot of because I don't have dementia yet. What's I gonna say again? Where you beat enemies and level up by like casting spells, and where you would trigger the spells by brushing past the katakana on a text board, and then you would basically go across the right ones in the right order, and then it will cast the spell. And if you went past it and you like hit certain other text in between, it would actually like trigger different spells, or you might fuck up the order that you may want the spells to trigger in. And the interesting thing about it is that you would basically have to balance the usage of spells with the amount of time left to beat the boss, in the sense that like the more you cast specific spells, the more it affects your stats, because casting the spell damages the enemy and also increases your stats, which carry forward to the next battle. So the more spells you cast, the more you can buff your stats for future battles, but the more you buff your stats, the less time you will end the battle with, and the less time you have at the end of the battle means that you have less gold, which then you have less money that you can spend to get better spells, which would then allow you to buff yourself even more, which is taking a lot of my breath to try to say that all in a single breath. But yeah, there's a lot of like trying to balance all of that to basically try to maximize your stat gain to be able to beat off the bosses. Didn't really feel like a roguelike game, that one, which was also pretty cool, since like the spells that you would start with are fixed, and when you lose a round and you restart the whole thing, you can kind of pick which spells to start with, and the enemies are all static as well, and the ways that you unlock spells that you can purchase are also about the same. So I found all of that to be fairly interesting. I think we played it on stream maybe once or twice, and I do like periodically play it on my own just because it's like a very simple and short experience that you can just like go through a single loop of. Truth be told, I'm surprised that it's actually not a mobile game, especially since the ways that you would actually try to slide the mouse, which you basically had to use your mouse as the player character as well. So while using the mouse to like cross the katakana, you also had to use the mouse to dodge attacks, or you would take damage as well. So a lot of it felt like something that would really work on like well, I guess no one's going to use a DS nowadays, since it's not that recent of a console anymore, but something that could also work on mobile as a game where you would use your finger or stylus to basically move the character around and also try to avoid damage, kind of like with Knights in the Nightmare back in the day. This is another game that you Zoomers are going to have no idea about. Got them all. Also, there were some foreign titles that, in my opinion, did a really good job of capturing the Japanese vibes that were there at the event as well. There's the casual city builder. I say city with a little bit of confusion because it felt more like a neighborhood builder with Minami Lane, where you basically have this very chill game where you just build buildings across a little street, and you expand the street, and you just like create a thriving like little street of stores and people in residential areas, which was made by a French couple. And you also had the game Stories from Seoul, the Gundog, which was a visual novel which really felt like it really captured the 90s 80s Japanese mecha vibes really well, made by a Welsh developer group as well. Like it was really interesting to just see all of the different developers that had come from overseas who were here just to showcase their game as well. Like the developers on Mi side, I don't think they themselves were directly at the event, but they did actually have a booth for Mi side where they're actually selling some merch for it as well, since the game did seem to have some level of popularity within Japan as well. But of course, it's not just like all of the games that were there were from overseas, although there was a decently big proportion of them that were, which is something that I kind of really expected before going down for the event, since the indie scene in Japan has not always been something that has been very massive. So I did expect there to be quite a few groups coming in from overseas to also showcase their game in hopes of getting into the Japanese market. But it was also cool to see that there were actually quite a few games coming out from indie studios within Japan. Also, as I mentioned before, they did have a ranking for the games that they thought were the most popular from the event. I think out of the 3 games that are on the popularity ranking, 2 of them aren't even out yet, so it was really cool to be able to test them that far in advance back in March. And then even now, as I make this video in July, like 2 of them are still like slated to release, one I think in October, so those are gonna come out a lot later. I think the game that was in top place was a deck builder game where you basically just draw a ton of cards and try to beat enemies in a single turn. I tried to get a chance to play the game at the location itself, but the queue was just so bad that I ended up giving up instead in favor of like being able to try a lot more other things at the event. Since at the time I looked at it and it felt like, yeah, it feels a little bit like Slay the Spire, but with more cardboard crack in your hands at any given time. And as we all know, people who play card games, the thing they love to do the most most is drawing cards. So I guess they were basically turning the crack up to 11. But apparently that game became the highest ranked game for the event. So it was a little surprising to see. The art aesthetic itself felt very anime, since it's this like anime pixel waifu doing like what felt like a little bit more visually stylish Slay the Spire with a lot more cut draw as well. The second was a visual novel with a very Kemona-ish vibe. For those of you who do not know what the word Kemona is, it's kind of like the I guess the closest thing you would have outside of Japan would be like a furry-ish sort of game, since like Kemona typically refers to stuff that like, you know, kind of like a little bit of made in Abyss with some of the characters, as well as more on games like Fuga, for example, where the characters are all like kind of half human anthropomorph or like Beastars, for example. Except this game felt like it was leaning more on the cutish side of all of it. And apparently that game, that visual novel, actually managed to come in second. But at the same time, I feel like it's not exactly, like furry isn't the best word to use, because it's kind of very different aesthetically in a way. Maybe you could say it's the Japanese equivalent of the furry community in a sense. But the Japanese art style, at least, a lot of it ends up being a little more, well, I wouldn't say it's like big, highly popular mainstream. It does find its way into mainstream because the characters tend to focus more on sometimes the cutesy side as well. And in a way, the art style between what I would generally imagine when I think of the furry community and the Kemona groups in Japan tend to be a little different while sharing a lot of similarities. So I don't know if using the right word is the same. Maybe some of you from overseas who are very knowledgeable about these communities can let me know, because I really don't know. But either way, it was kind of interesting to see that a visual novel got into second place as well. Although it was a little unfortunate that some of the other ones that I saw didn't actually make it there instead, since there were some other really cool ones as well, to be honest. And the third game is a top-down roguelike action game, which is one of the only 3 that were released. I think its rating on Steam is actually mixed, if anything, since people were saying that they really didn't like the balance of some of the skills and the attack patterns and all of that. But it is interesting to see that at least one of the 3 games were already out there. So for those of you who are interested in seeing like what I guess were fairly highly rated at this event are like, this is one of those that might actually be a good game that you could use as an experience to see what is considered to be fairly high up the top within the event. Truth be told, I feel like there are some parts of it that are still fairly rough around the edges, and I think like this is in part due to the fact that the developers themselves are still fairly fresh as well. But it was interesting to see, because I feel like for all of the titles that are in the ratings, at least those were intentionally the ones that were produced locally, since they kind of want to encourage people locally to produce more games, and most of the ones that came in from overseas were already successful titles. So it would be really weird to give people who are already successful with their successful game, you know, the top ranking at an event where you're trying to encourage new people to get into the scene, or people to make more games instead. And that's why the games got there as well. But either way, this was still games that were made by devs who seem to be really passionate about what they do. So if you're interested in seeing what the people at the event thought the event had to offer the best, I guess this is one of the games that would work best, probably in part because of the fact that you don't really need as much of Japanese knowledge as compared to a visual novel in order to be able to play. But yeah, either way, for people who are wondering how the event was like, I would say it really was very fun, because you really do get to experience and play a little bit, or even talk to the devs of some of the games that people are hyping up online, some of the new indie titles that are being showcased. They actually are at the event, and so you can play them like months ahead of time. So for those who really want to actually get a feel of the game itself, it kind of is like TGS in a way, but for indie, since you basically just go there and experience the game beforehand. Big difference, I guess, is that with these games, because they are much smaller scale and the event is much smaller scale, you don't end up queuing 3 hours to play a 15-minute game, and you actually do get to talk to the devs themselves more often than not. So in a way, it's more grassroots, which is basically what the indie community itself is. So yeah, if you're interested in indie games, or if you're an indie game developer, I guess it might be a lot more worthwhile to actually come down specifically for the event, since you basically get a chance to get your game out a little bit more marketed within Japan, and you get to talk to a lot and interact with many of the other indie developers who are at the event as well. Needless to say, because it's within Japan, the Japanese people, some of them don't speak English, so you might need to brush up on your Nihongo if you really want to be able to like communicate smoothly with them. But even then, you do have many other developers coming from all across the world to the event as well, so it's still a good chance to get to meet people and get your game out there even more, especially if it is one that actually gets very highly rated during the event. So you can basically use this as a chance to push or like get your game out there, while also using it as a chance to tour around Japan later on. Though for everyone else, I feel like this is not like a super big scale enough event for you to be like, oh yeah, you know, I'm gonna have my once in 3-4 years of like working overtime time every other day trip overseas. I wonder where I should go, and you're gonna go to Tokyo just to go for this event. I feel like it's not one of those. It's not like a Comic Cat or something like Comitia, or not even something like a Wonderfest, for example, where maybe if you're really into the thing, it might be worth the trip. But I do feel like, especially if you're already planning to come to Japan during that period, it might be a good event to drop by as part of a already planned for trip, since you do get to see a lot of very interesting new titles, and there are some that, who knows, it might be a good way to get to know more about some of the titles you might be anticipating in the future, or see some new unique titles that you might never have expected as well. Personally, I just hope the event continue to grow, more so because if it helps to foster a culture of the indie development scene in Japan even more, then it might lead in the future to the industry having much bigger range and variety in the games being produced, since, you know, rather than big companies, typically it's the small ones, the indies, who tend to be more risk-taking as well as more willing to try something experimental, since they're the ones who have the least to lose from doing so. And in order to get big in the first place, they need to find that unique thing that will get them popular. So in a way, the more these kind of events come up and at the bigger scale they get, the more it helps to encourage more people to experiment, which might also mean in the future more competition within the industry, which might lead to hopefully more growth as well. And with a little luck, who knows, maybe that might all just not be a pipe dream, if anything. God, I really do hope so. But anyway, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. I hope you found this look at the Stojin indie game event in Japan to be interesting. The reason why I keep mixing it up is because there is an actual other event that really feels more like a Dojin event as well, in a way that we will talk about in the future when I do go for it, which is also focused on indie games within Tokyo that also came out within the last like 5 years, so that might be interesting as well. Thank you to everyone who watched the video. I hope you all found it interesting, and thank you to the very cool people here who help to support the channel. It's thanks to you guys being really epic that I can continue to make all of this very cool stuff as well. And to everyone else of you as well who watched the video, since like it's thanks to all of you watching it that it gives me the motivation to make even more in the future. But anyway, that's all for today. I'll be seeing you on the next one. Until then, take care and bye-bye.